When I opened my grandmother's old diary, I didn't just find her words. I found her heart. It was hidden in a small wooden box, wrapped in a faded ribbon, tucked behind old clothes she never wore again. The pages were yellow, the ink almost gone, but every word felt alive, like she was whispering to me. And in that moment, I realized there was a side of her life none of us ever knew. That night felt different from the start. The house was silent, except for the soft ticking of the old clock in the hallway and the rain whispering against the windows. My grandmother's room had been closed for months after she passed away. No one really went inside. It felt like stepping into her presence again, and maybe that's what I needed. When I opened the door, a faint fragrance of rosewater and sandalwood greeted me, the same scent she used to wear. Everything was just as she had left it. The neatly folded shawls, her reading glasses resting beside the lamp, and the photo of her younger self smiling next to my grandfather. I sat down on the wooden floor, brushing dust from the corner cabinet. That's when I noticed something unusual. One of the bottom drawers didn't slide in properly. Curious, I pulled it open and saw the edge of a small wooden box tucked deep inside, half hidden beneath a stack of old scarves. It was carved beautifully, with faded flowers and a lock that had long rusted away. My heart started beating faster, not from fear, but from the strange pull of curiosity. I lifted it gently, blew off the dust, and held it close. It was heavier than I expected, as if it carried years of untold stories inside. The box was tied with a faded red ribbon. It looked fragile, yet strong enough to have survived decades. I hesitated before opening it. Something inside me whispered that once I did, nothing would be the same. Still, I slowly untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. A soft creak echoed through the room, and for a second, I felt like time had stopped. Inside was an old leather diary, its cover cracked and wrinkled with age. The edges were golden once, now dull and uneven. I touched it gently. The leather felt warm, almost alive. When I opened it, a delicate fragrance of old ink and jasmine escaped into the air. Her fragrance. My fingers trembled as I turned the first page. The handwriting was beautiful, elegant, graceful, and full of patience. She wrote about small things at first. The morning sun, the sound of birds, the day she planted roses in the garden. There was so much calm in those pages, like she had poured her soul into the simple rhythm of her days. But then, something shifted. The words became heavier, the lines longer, her tone quieter. I noticed tiny ink smudges, marks where tears might have fallen. She wrote about loneliness, about choices that haunted her, about the silence she learned to live with. I could almost feel her pain between the words. And then I turned to a page that made me stop. At the top, written in darker ink, were the words, "To the one I loved, but could never have." My hands froze. For a moment, I just stared at the line, my breath caught in my throat. I had never heard my grandmother speak of love, not even once. She was always the strong one, the calm one, the quiet backbone of the family. I turned the page slowly, and what I found next didn't feel like reading anymore. It felt like listening. She wrote about a man she once met by the river, how they'd talk for hours, about dreams and life and everything in between, how he made her laugh when the world felt heavy, and how one day he left, without a promise, without a reason. She waited, believing he'd return, but he never did. Her words grew shakier after that, as if she was writing through tears. She spoke of how her family would never have accepted him, how she had to bury that love deep inside and live a life chosen for her, not by her. Each sentence felt like a wound she had carried for years in silence. When I finally closed the diary, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. The woman I thought I knew all my life, my grandmother, was not just a caretaker, not just a storyteller. She was once a girl who loved deeply, who lost quietly, and who carried her heartbreak with grace. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just holding her diary. I was holding her truth, her heart, her unspoken story that had waited decades to be found. The year was 1956, long before I was born. But the more I read my grandmother's diary, the more I felt like I was living inside her world. Every word, every page, it wasn't just ink anymore. It was breath, heartbeat, and emotion. It felt like she was sitting beside me, telling me her story herself. She was only 19 back then, young, curious, and quietly rebellious, in a world that didn't allow girls to dream. Her village was small, surrounded by endless green fields and a river that sang softly through the nights. Life there followed rules that never changed. Women were supposed to stay quiet, live within the walls of their homes, and never let their hearts wander. Her father was a man of pride and reputation, strict, sharp, and respected by everyone. Her mother was gentle but silent, a woman who carried her emotions behind her eyes. My grandmother, being the eldest daughter, had to be perfect. She was expected to learn everything that made a woman respectable: how to serve tea properly, how to sew straight stitches, how to smile without speaking too much. But deep inside, she wasn't made for silence. She loved words. She loved the smell of old books and the feeling of paper under her fingers. Her teacher once let her borrow a poetry book, and she said that was the first time she truly felt alive. She used to write in small notebooks, dreams, thoughts, and wishes, then hide them under her mattress so her father wouldn't find them. And then, one summer afternoon, her whole life changed. She went to the riverbank to collect flowers for her mother. The sun was warm, the water was calm, and everything around her felt still, until she heard someone humming softly. When she looked up, she saw him, Adil. He was sitting under a large banyan tree with a sketchbook on his lap, drawing the river. He looked older, maybe in his 20s, with gentle eyes and hands stained with charcoal. He smiled at her, just a small, simple smile. But she wrote that it felt like time paused for a second. He said, "You walk like you're carrying sunlight in your hands." She laughed. She said it was the first time anyone had spoken to her that way. The next day she saw him again, and then again. At first, it was coincidence. Then it became something they both silently planned. She started bringing flowers she didn't need, pretending to fetch water, or just walking slowly enough to accidentally see him. They would talk by the river, softly so no one could hear. He told her about his city, about his art, about his dream of painting something that would live forever. She told him about her books, her poems, her wish to study more. She said he made her feel visible, like she wasn't just another quiet girl in a world that never listened. But deep down, they both knew their story had no place in their world. He wasn't from the same background, not from the same faith. In those times, that alone was enough to turn love into sin. She wrote that she tried to stay away, but her heart didn't listen. Each day apart felt like punishment, So she went back to the river again and again, even if it meant risking everything. Then came the day her father announced her marriage. The man was respectable, from a good family, someone she barely knew. She didn't argue. She couldn't. Daughters didn't argue back then. But that night, she wrote in her diary, "The river feels different when you know you can't return." A few days later, Adil came to see her one last time. It was raining, soft and steady. She stood by the river, holding her shawl tight, trying not to cry. He told her he was leaving for the city. His family had arranged his marriage, and he couldn't refuse. She didn't beg him to stay. She just smiled and said, "Don't stop drawing. Maybe someday you'll draw this river again, and I'll still be in it, somewhere in the reflection." When he walked away, she didn't run after him. She just stood there until the rain washed away her tears. That night, she wrote one final line about him. He left, and the river stopped singing. After that, her words changed. The pages became quieter, emptier. Sometimes she would only write a sentence. "I smiled today. The roses bloomed again. Some silences feel safe." She eventually married my grandfather. A good man, kind, patient, but not the one her heart had chosen. She built a family, raised her children, cooked, prayed, and smiled. Everyone saw her as strong and peaceful. But as I read her words, I realized peace isn't always happiness. Sometimes it's just acceptance. She never mentioned Adil again after those pages. But between every word, between every pause, I could feel his absence. It was there in her handwriting, in the empty spaces she left unfilled, like she was still waiting for him in her heart. When I closed the diary that night, I sat in silence for a long time. I looked around the room, the photos, the old shawl, the small cup on her bedside table, and everything suddenly felt different. It wasn't just her room anymore. It was a story of love that time had buried, a story she carried quietly all her life. And in that moment, I realized something I'll never forget. My grandmother wasn't just the woman who raised me. She was once a girl who loved deeply, lost silently, and lived beautifully, even with a heart that never fully healed. When I finished reading the diary, I just sat there, completely still. The rain outside had stopped, but I could still hear it in my mind, blending with her words. My grandmother's handwriting danced across my thoughts like echoes from another lifetime. For a long while, I didn't know what to feel. Sadness, love, admiration. It was all tangled together. It felt as if the woman I had known all my life had suddenly become a stranger, and yet, somehow, more familiar than ever before. I looked around her room, every corner, every little thing she'd left behind, and it all felt new now, heavy with meaning. The chair by the window where she used to sit every evening with a cup of tea wasn't just a chair anymore. It was the same spot she must have stared out from, maybe remembering him, maybe wondering what his life had become. The box of dried flowers on her dresser suddenly made sense. She had written once that flowers dry, but their scent lingers, just like love that refuses to fade. All her small habits, the way she'd smile softly at nothing, the way she'd pause before answering, the way her eyes always seemed to hold a faraway calm. It all made sense now. She wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she had already lived through everything that words could never fix. I realized that my grandmother had carried an entire life inside her, one that no one knew about. She loved deeply, but she never spoke of it. She lost, but she never complained. And maybe, in her silence, there was more strength than most people ever have in their loudest moments. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how she must have felt, loving someone so deeply, and then having to bury that love just to keep her family's honor intact. How she must have woken up every day pretending to be fine, while her heart quietly remembered. And still, she never let that pain turn her bitter. Instead, she raised her children with warmth. She cared for everyone. She smiled. Maybe that was her way of surviving, turning her heartbreak into kindness. For the first time, I understood her silences. The way she would sometimes look at the rain with that faint smile, or how she would hold a photo for a little too long before putting it away. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was memory. And then something strange happened. I began to see myself in her story, the way she felt trapped between what she wanted and what was expected, the way she learned to hide her feelings just to keep the peace. I realized I had been doing the same thing in my own life, pretending to be fine, staying quiet, not following what I truly wanted. Her diary didn't just tell me her story, it showed me mine. It was as if she had left those pages not to be discovered by accident, but to be found when I was ready. Ready to understand her. Ready to understand myself. By the time I closed the diary, the morning light had started to creep through the window. It fell softly on the cover, the same leather she had touched, the same pages that once caught her tears. And in that quiet moment, I felt her presence, not as a memory, but as a whisper. She had once written near the end of her diary, "Maybe my story will never be told, but if someday someone finds these pages, I hope they'll learn that love is never wasted, even if it doesn't last." That line stayed with me, because now I finally understood. Her story wasn't about loss. It was about love's endurance, about how even when life forces you to let go, love still finds a way to live, in silence, in gestures, in generations that follow. I closed the diary gently and held it to my chest. For the first time, I didn't see her as just my grandmother. I saw her as a woman, one who once dreamed, loved, and sacrificed. And as I whispered a quiet thank you, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just her story anymore. It had become mine too. The morning sun had already filled the room with a soft golden light when I finally placed the diary back where I'd found it. Everything around me looked the same, yet nothing truly was. That old wooden shelf, the ticking clock on the wall, the faint smell of jasmine she used to love, it all carried the weight of a story I could never unhear. For hours I sat there, staring at the diary, tracing my fingers along the worn leather cover. I realized that it wasn't just a collection of her memories. It was a bridge between who she was and who I was becoming. That simple book, hidden for decades, had somehow changed everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and silence. I walked outside into the garden she had cared for all her life. The morning dew still clung to the grass, and the old wooden bench under the tree stood exactly where she used to sit every evening. I could almost see her there, her soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes lost in thought, maybe remembering the boy by the river. I sat where she once did and closed my eyes. The wind brushed against my face, gentle but full of stories. I whispered her name softly, like I was calling her back for one last conversation. And in that moment, I didn't feel alone. I felt surrounded, by her love, her strength, her unspoken words that had finally found a voice through me. As I opened my eyes, I noticed something shining near the roots of the old tree. It was a small rusted locket, half buried in the soil. I picked it up, brushed the dirt away, and opened it carefully. Inside was a faded sketch of a young woman and a man standing by a river. Her handwriting on the back read, "For the love I was never allowed to keep, but always carried." My breath caught. After all these years, she had kept him close, hidden in the earth, as if the world wasn't ready for their story. But now, I was. I pressed the locket to my heart and felt tears roll down my cheeks, not out of sadness, but out of a strange, quiet gratitude. I finally understood that her silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. She didn't bury her love out of shame. She protected it, preserved it in a world that wouldn't understand. And now, by discovering her diary, I had been given the honor of carrying her truth forward. That day, I made a promise. To her, to myself, to the woman I was becoming. I promised I would never hide my feelings, never silence my heart the way she had to. That I would live loudly, love fearlessly, and never let fear decide who I became. Because now I knew what silence cost her, and I wouldn't let it cost me too. As I walked back inside, I placed the locket beside her framed photograph on the dresser. The woman in the photo was smiling, softly, knowingly. I felt as if she could see me, as if she was finally at peace. Before leaving the room, I whispered, "Your story won't stay hidden anymore." And in that quiet, sunlit moment, I felt something warm inside me, a sense of release, of healing. The air felt lighter, the silence softer. It wasn't grief anymore. It was legacy. Her story, once buried in an old diary, now lived in me. And I knew that was exactly how she wanted it to end. Some stories aren't written to be remembered. They're written to be felt. My grandmother's life taught me that love, no matter how hidden or unfinished, leaves a mark that time can't erase. She showed me that silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it's the only way a heart can survive in a world that refuses to listen. But most of all, her story reminded me that every emotion, love, pain, longing, sacrifice, deserves to be lived, not buried. We spend so much of our lives pretending to be fine, hiding what we feel just to be accepted. Yet the truth is, silence may protect us, but it also steals pieces of who we are. So if you love someone, tell them. If you dream of something, chase it. Don't wait for the right moment, because sometimes waiting becomes a lifetime. My grandmother didn't get to live her love, but she passed on something far greater, the courage to never let fear write my story for me. Her life was a whisper, but through that whisper, I learned to speak. And maybe that's the real message. Love bravely. Speak honestly. Live fully.